Tonight's program is another relatively new Wayne September came out. Another Wayne State University press book, the Detroit Symphony, Grace, Grit, and Glory. Now one of America's finest orchestras, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra began in 1887 as a small ensemble of around 35 players in a city that was just emerging as an industrial powerhouse. This is the first history of the DSO to document the orchestra from the earliest incarnation in the late 19th century, to its current status as one of the top orchestras in the country. We're very happy to have both the authors with us tonight. Laurie Harris, an author, editor, and publisher. She was the director of literary criticism series at Gale Research, where she began both the Shakespearean criticism and 19th century literature criticism series, and was editorial director at Mr. Ruffner's next company, the Graphics, where she began both Biography Today and Biography for Beginners. She's currently the publisher of Favorable Impressions, which continues to publish Biography for Beginners as part of the Lincoln Library's fact site database. Her most recent book, before tonight's topic, was The Great Migration to the North, 1900 to 1970. Her co-author is Paul Ganson. He was the first president and CEO of the same Orchestra Hall Incorporated until its consolidation with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra in 1989. He retired from the DSO in 2004.
Yes.
After 35 years as the assistant principal bassoonist, but he continues as the orchestra's historian. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I am Laurie Harris, and I'm here tonight with Paul Ganson to talk about our recent book, Detroit Symphony Orchestra, Grace, Grit, and Glory. Our presentation tonight focuses on the history of the DSO as seen through the prism of the city it has called home for 130 years. Since the 19th century, the orchestra and the city have grown and prospered. They have made their mark on a national scale in musical artistry for the symphony and in economic might for the city. They have each faced crises as well, financial, social, and cultural. These have forced the DSO out of existence 3 times and the city to bankruptcy. Yet in the face of adversity, they have revived and thrived. How did it happen, and what does it mean for the future of the orchestra and the city? Today we offer perspective on this shared story. We'll detail the orchestra cycle of growth, glory, collapse, and renewal in light of the city's own dynamic economic, demographic, and cultural changes. In 1805, most of the city of Detroit was destroyed in a devastating fire. One of the city's leaders, Father Gabriel Bouchard, famously vowed, "We hope for better things. It will arise from the ashes." That's where we'll start, as the new city of Detroit emerged from the ruins of the fire, and after the War of 1812 ended in 1815. The city and its population grew, reaching 21,000 residents by 1850, and as it grew, the demand for consumer goods and for culture grew as well. Immigrant groups continued to arrive in Detroit, many from New England, and beginning in the 1830s from Germany. Soon the Germans became the largest immigrant group in the region. They came for many reasons, seeking opportunities away from the political unrest in their own country and the chance to establish their own businesses in the growing city. In 1848, the continuing political unrest in Germany brought a group of musicians to the United States that would have a defining impact on the development of professional musical ensembles in Detroit and the country. The Germanian Musical Society, made up of 24 young professional musicians, left Germany in 1848 for the New World. They played their first concert in New York on October 5, 1848, and spent the next 6 years traveling the country. They brought performances of 19th century European classical music to the cities of the East Coast and Midwest. In all, they played over 900 concerts, and it's estimated that over 1 million people heard them in just 6 years. The Germania performed in Detroit in 1853 and 1854 to much acclaim. They provided programming that became something of a standard for American orchestras into the late 19th century. They played excerpts from classical symphonies by Beethoven and other European composers, arias and overtures from popular operas, and well-known folk tunes such as The Old Folks at Home. Detroit was so receptive to the Germania's music that 2 of its members, violinist Charles F. Stein and violist William Buchheister, decided to settle in the city, and they paid tribute to their adopted city, with Buchheister publishing his Belle Polka, singing the image dedicated to the ladies of Detroit. The influence of German immigrants on the musical vitality of Detroit continued for decades as more German musicians settled in the area. and often under the auspices of the Harmony Society and the Harmony Club gave concerts. Detroit was one of many American cities whose musical life was influenced by the influx of German immigrants. Germany had a history of strong monetary support for musical education and performance that dated back centuries. Most cities and towns in Germany still have opera houses and orchestras that were established in the 19th century. But even smaller cities had music ensembles, including brass bands, which provided the music for civic and religious events. Another popular form of ensemble music in Detroit, dating from the 1850s, was the military band.
And Detroit's military band was that for the Michigan Light Guard. And you see them here assembled on campus marches. Now, this is part of the script. She's very good about this. She keeps me very contained, very focused. But yes, you know, this was this is a photograph from 1861, which is, let's say, closer to the dawn of photography than our present day. And I was taken with two things. And this one, the registration is not good enough that you don't see that there was a horse and carriage here for a while. And then they decided to move out. They weren't in the photograph long enough to be completely registered. But also, it involves a bassoonist. And the moment I hear anything about a bassoon, I become suspicious. And this is Heinrich Kern, who was a German bassoonist. And he was the leader. He began just as a member of the Michigan Light Guard Band, but then became its leader. And you can tell that because here is his ghost. He originally was more a part of the band, but then this was all as he was waiting for the exposure to take its course. He thought, really, I should separate myself from the others. So, and this photograph tells that story as well.
Bassoonists don't always do that, though, do they?
No. That's what struck me as so extraordinary, because we're always very modest in the back of the orchestra, and if it weren't for the instruments sticking up in the air, people wouldn't give it. At any rate, also, they left in May by ship for Cleveland, and then from Cleveland by train to Washington when President Lincoln had put out the call for troops. And this was after the surrender of Fort Sumter. And they played on the White House lawn. And they were said to be the best band in Washington, even though they were one of the smaller orchestras. They did the most with what they had. And of course, President Lincoln was there and was listening from the balcony, and people wanted him to make a speech, and he said, no, I'm not going to make a speech today, but please come in for a reception. And they introduced him to the first citizens of Michigan, to the officers of the Michigan Light Guard, and then he said, President Lincoln said, I want to meet the enlisted men, all the troops. So they introduced the members of the Michigan Light Guard, and he said he wanted to meet the band. And when he met Heinrich Kern, when Heinrich Kern was introduced to him, he said, my God, you must be the biggest blower in the service. Because at that time, Heinrich Kern weighed 375 pounds.
You can see him in the picture up there. He's the one in the last row, at the very end of the row with his bassoon.
This is the German Veterans Orchestra, and they were obviously veterans of the American Civil War. And they are posed there on the front steps of the Arbeiter Hall, the Workman's Hall, as it was in the center of Detroit. And that picture is from 1870, 9 years after the previous one. But Heinrich Kern went to the bottom on the left and the top on the right.
This time he didn't move.
No. And obviously, you know, they didn't have to stand as long. And now, I mean, just imagine what we could do if we were there with our smartphones. Yes.
After the war, another important figure appeared on the American musical scene. In 1869, the German-born conductor Theodore Thomas began touring with his own ensemble, the Theodore Thomas Orchestra. They offered classical music to Midwestern cities like Detroit, traveling, in the words of his wife Grosse, the great musical highway of America. On March 29, 1869, Detroit Opera House opened to much fanfare. Situated on campus marshes, it was a gracious and awe-inspiring setting called a luxurious temple of art by the Detroit Free Press. On its ground floor was the very first clothing store opened by J.L. Hudson, whose name would be synonymous with Detroit for more than 100 years. In November 1869, it hosted what is considered the first professional symphony concert, Theodore Thomas and his orchestra. On December 18, 1887, the Detroit Free Press carried an announcement of what is considered the first Detroit Symphony Orchestra. Its founders included many recognizable names from the history of the founding of the city, still known to us today: Bagley, Russell, Campbell, Miller, Walker, and McMillan. However, these were the sons of the famous founders of Detroit in their 20s when they became the benefactors of the fledgling DSO. They were also coming of age during an important historical era in American culture: the establishment of the first permanent professional orchestras in the country. In 1887, Detroit became only the fourth city in the country to establish a permanent symphony orchestra. The first, the New York Philharmonic, was founded in 1842. The next, the St. Louis Symphony, was founded in 1880. The next year, 1881, marked the establishment of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. These first professional orchestras were in part an outgrowth of a movement called Make America Musical. It championed the idea that a permanent professional orchestra was good for society. It was a sign of a city's progress, a reflection of its industrial stature and wealth, and a measure of its cultural and social achievement. Between 1887 and 1918, many other American cities, flush with wealth from a booming economy, followed, as permanent orchestras were established in 12 more cities, including Chicago, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, and Cleveland. In Detroit, the development of a permanent symphony orchestra was funded in part by a wealthy elite, with almost a sense of noblesse oblige. They saw it as their responsibility to provide money, vision, and an audience. However, the funding levels provided by the wealthy elite of Detroit never came close to matching the amount spent in other cities. That financial fact did much to determine the fate of the first Detroit Symphony Orchestra, from its first concert in 1887 to its last in 1910. The first concert of the newly formed Detroit Symphony Orchestra took place on December 19, 1887, at the Detroit Opera House. With Rudolf Speil at the helm, the ensemble played works by Beethoven, Gounod, Berlioz, Verdi, and Liszt. The first concert received good reviews from the local press, including the Free Press and the Detroit Evening News. But by the end of the first season, there were problems in funding the ensemble, and its future was shaky. That first DSO was funded by subscriptions of $5 and $10 per season, handled by perhaps the hardest working individual in DSO history, Fritz Kalsow, the orchestra's manager. That first DSO faced a lot of competition from listeners. In just 1 week in 1888, when the DSO was giving one of its 4 annual concerts, audiences could enjoy performances by 3 other opera companies, and that was just opera. Listeners also could hear music in beer gardens, band concerts, vaudeville acts, and chamber music performances, all given on a regular basis in the city at that time. That first DSO generally gave 4 concerts a year on an annual budget of between $2,000 and $3,000, numbers that varied little during the 23 years of that first DSO's existence. This contrasts sharply with what was happening in cities like Boston. The Boston Symphony Orchestra had been created by businessman and philanthropist Henry Lee Higginson in 1881, who invested $120,000 of his own money to fund the symphony. He lost that, but continued to fund the orchestra, and within several years had turned a profit. What happened in Chicago was even more illuminating. In 1890, businessman Charles Norman Fay asked Theodore Thomas if he would move to Chicago to help establish a permanent symphony orchestra. Fay raised more than $50,000 quickly from donors of wealthy and more modest means. And when Theodore Thomas demanded that a new performance space be built for the symphony, more than 8,000 contributors came forward, some of whom gave only 10 cents, but all of whom saw the hall as a source of citywide pride. The contrast with the DSO, which with total income hovering between $2,000 and $3,000 a year, and which could barely support an ensemble playing 4 concerts a year, raises a question. Why didn't one individual or a group of individuals step forward with a similar plan? Still, the DSO soldiered on, with revenue hovering around the same level, the same number of concerts, and the same repertoire. In 1900, the 13th year of the DSO's existence, it looked like hope was finally on the horizon. Hugo Kalsow, son of manager Fritz Kalsow, returned from his training in Europe to become the conductor of the DSO. There was much anticipation that he would be the catalyst to a new and reinvigorated orchestra. But while the first reviews of the DSO de Calzo were positive, things didn't change, and the audiences dwindled. So the first DSO quietly went out of business for the first time in 1910. Its passing not even mentioned in the free press.
At a later time, that the DSO was also silent was 1942-43. And in a book written at that time called Detroit City of Destiny, the author looks back to that time when Fritz Calso was the manager of that first Detroit Symphony Orchestra. Beyond the memories of many of the patrons of the present orchestra would be the orchestra that was fostered by Fritz Calso. His season consisted of 3 or 4 concerts, and all the players were local musicians with purely local reputations. Starting early in the spring, Mr. Calso toiled early and late for 8 months out of the year to make his dream of a great symphony orchestra in Detroit a reality. He called from door to door, walked from one office building to another, explaining the desperate need for subscribers, and presenting his well-worn subscription book for the signatures of those whose regard for music would prompt them to disgorge $5, the price of 2 tickets for each of the concerts. And those books are still in the Detroit Public Library, which is the subject of the next lecture here.
Yes.
In the
for our publishing. Yes.
And
for the DPL, which is such an exquisite building.
Yes.
Wonderful collection, wonderful librarians.
It's incredible how the orchestra reaches out to so many different areas and people, and they also reach back to it. And you say, well, how could the orchestra go out of business 3 times, still be in business, still have a reputation and all of that? And that's the beginning of the foundation and the web of relationships that has kept it all these years.
The DSO was reborn in 1914, when Detroit had also been transformed. For the first time, the city had grown in size and economic might to become one of the top industrial regions in the country. The size and scope of the growth of Detroit is staggering. Between 1910 and 1920, the population of the city more than doubled to almost 1 million. Its area nearly doubled too, moving Detroit from the nation's 9th largest city to its 4th. The city's tremendous growth was fueled by a meteoric rise of the auto industry. In 1910, Detroit's factories produced 180,000 cars. In 1920, that number had grown to 1.9 million. This explosion of wealth created a class of philanthropists in Detroit who funded the city's arts and cultural organizations. And it allowed the most significant patrons of the new DSO, especially William H. Murphy, Jerome Remini, and Horace Dodge, to provide the funding necessary to bring about a symphony of the first rank. In 1913, a group of Detroit's wealthiest women raised money for an orchestra made up of local musicians to play a sample concert. They wanted to gauge the interest in Detroit in a new permanent symphony orchestra in the city. In January 1914, the concert was presented under the direction of Weston Gales. It was a great success. Thus, the DSO was brought back to life, funded by a small group of wealthy donors, and playing its first official concert on November 19, 1914. Gales led the orchestra from 1914 to 1917, expanding the number of concerts and promoting the new symphony. To the press, he outlined the problems confronting the new ensemble. What do we need for the orchestra most of all? Money, he claimed. They also needed a hall of their own, he said, and a solid base of support among all the people of Detroit, not just the wealthy elite. While these goals would eventually be met, they were to happen under Gale's leadership. He left Detroit in December 1917, resigning abruptly. The good news in this was that he was replaced by one of the greatest figures in the history of the Detroit Symphony, Osip Gabrilowitsch. It is hard to overemphasize Gabrilovich's impact. He was a musician of the first order, an outstanding pianist and conductor, whose talents were much in demand. While known to some as the son-in-law of Mark Twain, he married Claire Clemens in 1909, Gabrilowitsch soon made a name for himself in Detroit, with praise pouring in from concertgoers and critics alike for his artistry and leadership. And there he is with Claire. And when in 1919 he insisted that a new hall be built for the orchestra, threatening to quit if it was not, the wealthy patrons of the DSO raised nearly $1 million to fund one of Detroit's finest architectural gems, Orchestra Hall. This incomparable building of acoustical perfection was also built in just over 4 months, a marvel in every way.
It was designed by C. Howard Crane, known for his famous movie houses, including the Fox Theater. Yet Orchestra Hall had an exterior unlike Crane's lavish and Baroque movie theater designs. Instead, it featured a combination of Beaux-Art and Art Deco elements and classical elegant lines. But it was the interior, especially the acoustic properties of the hall, that made it so exceptional. No one is exactly sure how Crane was able to create such an acoustical gem, but he incorporated a fan shape to the design, which was in keeping with the structure of the early movie houses he had designed. This shape sent out sound from the stage to tiers of 2,200 seats, set at angles so that each one commanded an unobstructed view of the stage. Crane also used irregular and uneven surfaces throughout the interior, with heavily ornamented designs and ornate plasterwork to diffuse the sound. During the renovation of Orchestra Hall in the 1970s, it was discovered that the plaster on the right side of the hall is 1/2 inch thicker than on the left. Even the walls vary in width by as much as 2 or 3 feet. The ornamentation and the asymmetry all added to the enhanced acoustics of the hall. So did the materials used to build the stage, which is hard maple in front and soft pine in the back, to add to the scattering of the sound as it reverberates out from the stage.
Orchestra Hall opened on October 23, 1919, and over the next 2 decades, Gavrilovich and the DSO played seasons of outstanding concerts and hosted some of the finest guest musicians in the world. As the orchestra grew in renown, Gavrilovich brought fame and revenue to his new orchestra. Among important firsts for the DSO that happened under Gavrilovich occurred in 1922, when he directed them in the first symphonic concert for a radio audience on radio station WWJ, the Detroit News. Another first for the DSO in Detroit occurred in the 1920s, when Gavrilovich brought Edith Retz-Tilton to Detroit to serve as the first educational director of the DSO. Over 3 decades, she established music curriculums and generations of listeners and supporters for the DSO, first in Detroit and throughout the state. Then, just 10 years into Gavrilovich's tenure with the DSO, the Great Depression devastated the finances of the orchestra, its city, and the country. Because of its dependence on automobile manufacturing, Detroit was one of the first cities in the nation to suffer the effects of the Depression. But look at the total number of cars produced from 1929 to 1931 tells the story. In 1929, 5.3 million were manufactured. In 1931, that number fell to 1.3 million. There were huge job losses. Many of the city's wealthy had lost substantial amounts of money during the Depression, and its effect was felt among the donors to the Detroit Symphony as well. The number of concerts was reduced, and the salaries of everyone, from the musician to the manager, were cut. One of the few bright spots was the participation of the DSO in the Century of Progress exhibition in Chicago in 1934, which led to the Ford Sunday evening radio broadcast, featuring the DSO, which provided much-needed income to the orchestra. Yet by this time, Gavrilovich was ill with what turned out to be cancer. He conducted his final concert on March 14, 1935, and died in September 1936. He was mourned throughout the musical world. With their charismatic maestro gone, and the country, especially Detroit, still mired in the worst depression in its history, the future looked bleak for the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. The financial problems of the DSO continued throughout the 1930s. Victor Kolar was the orchestra's conductor and brought a calm, knowledgeable leadership to his role. But the most important of the orchestra's woes was revealed in 1938. Not only did the DSO have financial problems, it had lost Orchestra Hall to foreclosure. Looking for a new home, the DSO moved to the Masonic Temple, which offered significant savings to give the orchestra as a tenant. It was a larger venue with seating for 4,600, and they promised to offer more tickets at lower prices, hoping to bring in a new tier of patrons for the DSO. The move to Masonic Temple increased revenue at first, as more people than ever bought tickets to see the symphony. Yet the new revenue wasn't enough to keep them solvent. But there was more bad news on the horizon. Income from the popular Ford Sunday evening hour broadcast began to decline, as Ford paid significantly less each year for the DSO. And in December 1941, the orchestra, the city, and the country found themselves transformed by a devastating new reality as the U.S. entered World War II. Detroit geared up to play a crucial role in supplying the Allies, becoming the central force in the nation's arsenal of democracy. The DSO played its part too, representing the Allied Music Festival, which was praised in the Detroit News as for the good of Detroit, for the good of the nation, for the good of the United Powers against the forces of evil and degeneration. But the financial problems of the DSO continued. In 1942, Ford withdrew all the funding for the Sunday evening hour broadcasts. At the same time, negotiations were underway between the DSO management and musicians union. They could not reach an agreement, and on September 29, 1942, the board canceled the season. The DSO went out of business for the second time.
The reaction in the press was harsh. The Free Press claimed that Detroit has suffered a blow to its musical prestige with the suspension of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra season, from which it may not recover within the experience of this generation. All because one of the richest cities in the world was so money timid that it would not guarantee the funds for a complete season. Thus, the long arm of Hitler and his pals has reached into the citadel of war industry and made its musical leaders knuckle under. Musical America, a national publication, was even harsher. Detroit is to be sternly rebuked. Music is too vital to the public morale and therefore to the entire war effort for any such major disaffection to be accepted without the censure it so emphatically deserves. So the Detroit Symphony Orchestra fell silent once again. But the symphony's own home, Orchestra Hall, was undergoing changes. When the DSO left Orchestra Hall in 1939 for Masonic Temple, the great performance space stood virtually vacant for 2 years. It reopened on December 26, 1941 as the Paradise Theater. The building had been purchased by two brothers, Ben and Lou Cohen, who wanted to present the best of jazz and big band music in their new venue. They did just that. Over the years, some of the finest performers in the history of American jazz took the stage, including instrumentalists Louis Armstrong, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Lionel Hampton, Cab Calloway, Billy Eckstine, Jimmy Lunsford, Earl Hines, and Charlie Parker, as well as the famed jazz singers Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, and Lena Horne. It was the one venue in the entire United States where Lena Horne said proudly into microphones throughout the United States, "There's a place where I sing without a microphone." Paradise Theater, Old Orchestra Hall in Detroit.
The next chapter of the DSO's history is a complete anomaly, a bizarre interlude in its 130-year existence. In September 1943, the DSO came back to life under the ownership of wealthy businessman Henry Reichold, owner of Reichold Chemical. He oversaw its rapid expansion and tempestuous demise, all within 6 years. Reichold was a true one-man band, one individual who exerted great power and influence over the orchestra, whose decisions were to be questioned by his board or by anyone else. His autocratic reign came to an end in September 1949, as once again the DSO went out of business for the third time in its history. It would be 2 long and dreary years until the DSO would re-emerge again, this time to usher in another era of greatness. When the DSO came back into being in 1952, it was under the new leadership and a new form of funding, too. Called the Detroit Plan, it was the idea of Grosse Pointer John B. Ford of the Chemical Forts, who wrote, "I felt that a new method of financing symphony orchestras was imperative. With income tax rates for the richest Americans topping out at 87% in 1951, there were far fewer wealthy patrons who could freely fund a symphony orchestra. Instead, Ford recommended a new model, a coalition of corporations, foundations, the community at large, and labor. That's what Ford set out to build. His plan included a roster of the biggest corporations in Detroit, who gave equal amounts, $10,000 each, for 3 years. Each of these contributors would also have a seat on the board of directors and the Policy and Finance Committee. All votes would be of equal value, so that there could be no criticism of any one organization dominating the policy of the orchestra. The first organization Ford approached was the Musicians Union. They agreed wholeheartedly and became the first sponsor. Then Ford approached the leaders of the major corporations in the city, winning their support. That first roster included most of the major companies in the city, all the major auto companies, major manufacturing companies, banks, department stores, and more. And in every case, it was the president of these organizations who became members of the board. Next, Ford approached the leaders of the city of Detroit, who readily agreed. All the contributors saw their support of the orchestra as part of their civic duty to the city, their employees, and the people of the region. With its financing, and especially its broad-based civic support in place, the search was on for a new music director. The choice was a brilliant one. Paul Paret, French conductor and composer, an outstanding musician and humanitarian, and the clear favorite of the public. From the beginning of his tenure in 1952 until he left in 1963, he was among the most popular directors in the history of the DSO. Under his direction, the DSO became a nationally ranked symphony once again, and his reputation was earned not just with performances at Masonic Temple, but through a series of 70 recordings the DSO made under Paret's direction. These are considered among the finest and most highly prized performances ever produced, and most were produced at the auditorium at Castet, whose acoustic properties were described by the Mercury production staff as perfect, especially for the French music that was Paret's specialty. In fact, under Paret, the DSO became known as the greatest French orchestra in the world. And what did that mean? Fast tempos, lyrical elegance, and a dynamic, sparkling clarity of sound.
Got to be very quiet. This is not very loud. I apologize.
In 1955, the DSO once again had a performance space to call its own. After the Reichhold era, the symphony had moved back to Masonic Temple, and in 1955, the DSO announced the building of Ford Auditorium.
Not exactly the acoustics of Orchestra
Oh
Hall.
my God, I know. Terrible.
I'm sorry.
No, there are all kinds of
Excuse
great
me.
quotes, including one by a great
I apologize.
You go ahead.
I couldn't resist.
Go ahead and tell the wonderful bassoonist categorization of the acoustics
At Ford Auditorium.
Lyle Lindsay, yes, I know the contrabassoonist. He just, described them as hopeless, or without an ear to stand on.
Thank you. Excuse me.
When the building, the Ford Auditorium, was dedicated on October 15, 1956, it put Detroit in the spotlight once again, with national coverage, including live broadcasts of the Ed Sullivan Show coming from the auditorium. Paret continued to bring honors and recognition to Detroit, hosting such outstanding soloists as Roberta Peters. He also conducted the DSO at Carnegie Hall, the United Nations, and during performances at the Worcester Music Festival.
Detroiters loved their maestro, and his influence was felt in the large, appreciative audiences who attended DSO concerts, and the outcry of the people of Detroit when he announced his retirement in 1961. Hundreds of petitions and the newspapers begged him to reconsider, but Paret left the city in 1962, retiring to his home in France. The next era of the DSO begins in 1963, when both Detroit and the DSO were full of optimism. The new young maestro, Sixten Ehrling, stated he would preserve the greatness of the ensemble left to him by Paret, but he also wanted to pursue more modern works for the symphony, and during his decade with the DSO, made good on that goal, directed 722 total works of music, including 24 world premieres, a record for the symphony. One of the early triumphs of the DSO during the early era was the building of Meadowbrook, the summer home of the orchestra for several decades. Its purpose was, according to auto executive Bunky Knudsen, to provide an opportunity for everyone in the community to enjoy great music of great artistic value at low cost in a beautiful setting. The new venue debuted in July 1964 to much acclaim featuring world-famous musicians performing and teaching in the bucolic setting of what would become Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan. Another famed but decidedly different kind of music was being made by orchestra musicians after work and on their own time. In the mid-1960s, several members of the orchestra, notably a group of string players led by assistant concertmaster Gordon Staples, were moonlighting with a very special, very Detroit group of musicians, the Funk Brothers, the legendary Motown house band who created the inimitable Motown sound. But the summer of 1967 brought a very different spirit to Detroit. It was the summer of violence in the model city, as the title of Sidney T. Fine's lauded study on the Detroit riot of 1967 defined it. The DSO offered no formal response to the riots, but new initiatives began that were more inclusive, including the Detroit Symphony Youth Orchestra, sponsored by my co-presenter, Paul Ganson.
Its purpose was to provide musical instruction to talented young musicians from the Detroit area, and also a training ground for the orchestra itself. As the first auditions got underway, some 350 young instrumentalists played for members of the DSO and local music educators. 112 hard-working and accomplished musicians who won a place in the ensemble gathered to rehearse on Saturdays under the baton of Sixton Ehrlich, the music advisor to the organization, as well as other outstanding conductors. And many of the members of that orchestra came from Grosse Pointe South and Grosse Pointe North. In 1970, it also marked the debut of Paul Freeman, who joined the DSO as conductor in residence and the first conductor of the Symphony's Youth Orchestra. In Detroit, he championed African American music, and during his 9 years with the orchestra, was the conductor on a series of recordings with the DSO, which were featured on Columbia Records' Black Composer Series.
Another major initiative, also led by my friend and colleague, involved the saving of Orchestra Hall.
I'm impressed. You knew Duke Ellington. Wow.
For a very short period of time. The only good thing I did when he realized that he was going to be photographed, he thought he had not a very good tie, and he would like a different one. So I immediately went to the band director from Inkster, Michigan, and he had a tie that Duke really thought was great. And at the end of the thing, he said to the conductor from Inkster, he said, here's your tie necklace. I said, no, you keep it. I'm going to keep yours.
Thank you. Very good.
Well, the musical future of the DSO.
Just when you're talking about Duke Ellington, the dog that they have, the canine, they named it Duke Ellington because Gretchen gave the money. So that's what the dog's name is, Duke Ellington.
I see, okay. And it was amazing too, because a moment of confession. I mean, it kind of blows my standing as a presenter. But my immediate reaction was when Marshall Turkin, our manager, said, "Oh, by the way, he said, you guys are playing with Duke out at the Light Guard Armory. I'll get him to come down and speak to the music educators you gathered." And I thought, what's he going to say? I mean, what can he say? I mean, I've thought of all beautiful moral and musical, words that could be used to describe what we're trying to do. He's just kind of, color commentator or something. And Duke came to the meeting, and he spoke, and he was absolutely mesmerizing. Mm-hmm. I said, if in addition to everything he does so wonderfully on the stage, he could also be in charge of music for young people and education. It was an extraordinary moment and very humbling for me. While the musical future of the DSO was being developed in the new Detroit Symphony Youth Orchestra, a splendid artifact of the orchestra's past was about to face the wrecking ball. On September 17, 1970, a guard at the bank across the street from Orchestra Hall, which had been boarded up after years of neglect, noticed 2 men working on the hall. He contacted his building's leasing manager, Dick Megan, who discovered that the men were from the water board, and that the acoustical marble had been served, which had served as the Detroit Symphony Orchestra's first home, had been sold that day and was scheduled to be demolished in 2 weeks. Megan in turn contacted me, and the campaign to rescue Orchestra Hall began. The group acted quickly, first securing the help of Mel Ravels, who was then president of the Detroit Common Council, to stay the demolition order. Next, we formed the Committee to Save Orchestra Hall, made up of musicians, music lovers, architects, historic preservationists, and other concerned members of the community. Our first order of business was gaining time to apply for historical landmark status for the building. Orchestra Hall had just turned 50 years of age and was therefore eligible for protection under federal law governing buildings of historic significance. While that effort was in progress, the group contacted Geno's Incorporated, the fast food chain owned by former football great Gino Marchetti that had bought the hall. Then, just as the Save Orchestra Hall initiative got going, Geno's made a surprising decision. They offered to sell the hall back to Save Orchestra Hall and also gave us time to raise the money to do so, and only for the price they had paid, in addition to the costs associated with the sale. It granted the great old hall a reprieve, and fundraising efforts began immediately.
So Gino's Pizza almost went.
Gino's Pizza, this was Gino, okay, it was a burger place.
A burger place,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, excuse me.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's all right. Everybody assumed that. In
Yeah.
fact, at the meeting of the City Planning Commission, when this was all announced, and then the press came forward and said, was there anything, they asked of the Geno's officials, they said, is there anything you'd like to say to the very grateful people of Detroit? And he said, yes, tell them we don't make pizza.
Very good, thank you.
Similarly to the DSO in 1972, during turbulent times, another recession took hold in Detroit with a vengeance. Over the span of just 10 years, Detroit lost 1/3 of its total jobs. The population dropped as well to 1.3 million. Yet despite the bad news, by 1977, hope was on the horizon once again, as a new conductor took the podium. The next era of the DSO, from 1977 to 1990, revealed an orchestra and a city in flux. It begins with the arrival of Anton Jarratti, whom some of you may remember gazing down from billboards on the freeways of Detroit, announcing his arrival. He arrived in Detroit to much fanfare to direct the Beethoven Festival, the first of a new tradition of festivals devoted to classical music giants. Jarratti had been given the mandate to raise the orchestra to world-class status, and he battled mightily with the board of directors over his 4-year tenure to achieve that goal. He was already known for his own large list of recordings, and soon he had the DSO back in the recording studio. One of their first recordings, in Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, became the best-selling classical record in the country. Under Jarratti, the orchestra also distinguished itself in a recording of the works of a giant of American classical music, Aaron Copland. Here we go again.
There we go again.
And under Jarratti, the DSO achieved another important first, its first European tour. Jarratti set out to prove that the orchestra deserved to be known as a cultural asset of international renown. By nearly all accounts, he achieved that goal admirably. The European tour took place in November 1979 and included 24 sold-out concerts in 23 cities. The response from the European audience was overwhelmingly positive. We had a full 15-minute standing ovation in Berlin. And finally, after that 15 minutes, Jarratti had to come back out of the stage in his shirt sleeves and tell everyone to go home. Yet, this artistic success was enormously costly, resulting in huge deficits. It led to a battle between Jarratti and the board as he continued to argue for greater amounts of money to achieve his goals.
By the middle of 1980, both the orchestra and the city were again in dire economic straits. Detroit was in the throes of another recession, and the orchestra suffered right along with the city. Donations dwindled and grants were canceled. In response, the DSO board canceled tours to New York, Washington, and other cities, and all funding to the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. The board also met with Jarratti to negotiate his contract to remain in Detroit. In the end, they could not come to an agreement. So after 4 artistically, fruitful, yet tempestuous years, he left. He was replaced by Günter Herbig, music director of the DSO from 1983 to 1989. Herbig, from East Germany, was something of a surprise choice, little known in the U.S., but a good choice, according to Detroit news critic Nancy Malitz. She called him fully formed, thoroughly competent, and far better than any American the DSO in its crisis could have seduced. Detroiters embraced the new director, and subscriptions were up 35% in his first years. The DSO made a triumphant return to Carnegie Hall, with critics praising the sound the orchestra made under their new conductor. In February 1987, the DSO made an important announcement. They were returning to Orchestra Hall. And Mary, wait a minute.
Anyone
There he is.
There he is.
Oh.
Did they make you move as they were doing that work? They made you move as they worked around you? Or what?
No, they were very, very, very willing to assist, but I don't know what it was they were pumping into my head there. It's kept me alive for how long. And I wanted to say, anyone that recognized the clip of the photographs, and if you recognize whose photograph came up when Günter Herbig was spoken about, you're entitled to buy a copy of the book. Because we have a very few.
But problems persisted. When negotiations for a new contract broke down between the musicians and management, a strike was called, which lasted 3 months. In May 1988, Herbig announced he would leave Detroit, citing the board's inability to meet his requirements. There was still more bad news for the DSO. Herbig was able to take them on a European tour in January '89, but while they were gone, another financial crisis arose. A huge gap of $1.1 million in cash required just to keep the DSO in business had to be covered by GM, Ford, and Chrysler. As Herbig left the DSO in 1989, times were dire again. This was the situation that greeted the DSO's new director, Estonian-born Mimi Järvi. When Järvi took over in 1990, he radiated artistry and leadership, as well as charm and optimism. It was a combination that endeared him to Detroit and would make him one of the most popular and successful directors in the orchestra's history. The rapport between music director, musicians, and audience was immediate and electric. Ticket sales grew by 22% in Järvi's first year, reaching more than 250,000 individual tickets by the end of the season. Järvi came to Detroit with an impressive list of recordings to his name. Soon he would add to that. Within months, he signed a 5-record contract with Chandos to make recordings with the DSO. They featured what became the best-selling and critically acclaimed collection, the American Series. Then, just as Järvi's second year as music director began, the DSO was confronted with another financial crisis, as Governor John Engler announced cuts of $1.9 million in support. Despite the grim news, Järvi and the DSO made a triumphant return to Carnegie Hall. New York Times critic Alan Kozin, writing about the orchestra in light of its financial woes, noted that the musicians showed what was at stake is a first-class ensemble with a sound that is impressively polished and warm.
Can you go back? I lost it somehow. There we go. Sorry. Okay, now I'm not getting the mouse. There we go. Come on. There we go. Look at this.
Okay, you know what, that happened at the history conference, and if it's reading that it means it can't read
You can't read it, yeah. Yeah.
it. You know what, all of these are mentioned in the book, and you
Kodak.
can also find all of the recordings that are described in the book are available through your library network. I live in Pleasant Ridge, we're part of Huntington Woods, which is part of the library network. I also got a lot of these down from the main branch of the DPL, so if you want to hear yourself as loud as you want to hear,
That's right.
you can do it. Okay.
One of Järvi's most important characteristics as music director was his conducting style. It reflected his belief in spontaneity, in rehearsal and in performance. Often he would rehearse a piece one way, then change his interpretation during a concert. And you better know what happened. I mean, you better get there before he did. It's impossible. According to music critic Lawrence B. Johnson, this taught the musicians to be quick and adaptable. At any given performance, the musician who does not pay attention to the man up front may well find himself out of sync. If he simply assumes the music flying by will go just the way Jarratti did it in rehearsal, or even in the previous performance.
The good news for the DSO under Jarratti continued. In March 1996, the DSO announced an unprecedented plan for growth in Detroit, an $80 million project that would develop the area around Orchestra Hall. The concept came from Peter Cummings, son-in-law of philanthropist Max Fisher, who told Cummings to think bigger in planning the expansion, and became one of the major contributors to the project. In the midst of renovation, the DSO went on a European tour, its first in 9 years, in the spring of '98. Once again, the orchestra scored a great success. In 1998, Peter Cummings announced an expanded plan for Orchestra Place, with an expansion of the existing building, a renovation of Orchestra Hall, and a new recital hall, too. This re-envisioned space would be called the Max M. Fisher Music Center. In July 2001, as the DSO prepared for its next European tour, Jarratti suffered a stroke. His doctors predicted a full recovery, but now the orchestra had to find a replacement for their beloved maestro for the upcoming tour, scheduled for October 2001. In the midst of preparations, the terrorist attacks of September 11th occurred, bringing the nation and the world to a halt. After much discussion, the DSO members decided to go ahead with the tour, and became the first U.S. orchestra to travel after the attacks. Jarratti returned to Detroit with his beloved orchestra in November 2001, his vigor restored. But just 6 months later, he announced his retirement, saying he would leave the DSO in 2005. But before that happened, Jarratti oversaw the opening of the Max. When the Max opened on October 11, 2003, Detroit marveled at the renovation. A sold-out crowd attended the opening, where its patrons took in the 4-story glass atrium, the stunning renovation of the hall, and the new music box recital space. As his time with the DSO drew to a close, the longtime director said, "For me, the highlights are in the quality of the relationship, the mutual understanding. What have we achieved? Look at the spaces around the Max. It was the ugliest place when I came here, empty. But now we have the Max, and the music school, and many other new buildings going up. The DSO achieved this. The vision was right."
Jarretti's final concert, part of the Jarratti Fest, that celebrated his 15 years with the orchestra, was described by music critic Mary Ellen Hutton as follows. The concert's most poignant moment was the encore, Shostakovich's Romancing Sea, performed by DSO concertmaster Emmanuel Boithier, whose tender brush tones spoke volumes about the player's affection for their retiring leader.
Won't do it again, I'm sorry.
It is such a beautiful piece.
I'm so sorry.
You've got to go.
I have to go
find
listen to
this
it,
in,
yep.
okay? After naming Jarratti left Detroit in 2005, the search for a new director continued for several years. One candidate stood out for many symphony watchers. In June 2007, Leonard Slatkin, a prominent American conductor, appeared as a guest conductor and showed a great rapport with the orchestra. That October, Slatkin was chosen to be the DSO's 12th music director. But as Slatkin prepared to come to Detroit, bad economic news emerged from the orchestra, as deficits and revenue gaps dragged down the organization. When the financial crisis did hit in September 2008, it left the city, the state, and the nation reeling in what would become the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. The economic crisis wreaked havoc on the budgets of businesses and nonprofits throughout the country, and worsened the financial woes of the DSO. The endowment lost more than $38 million in just 1 year. This was the atmosphere in Detroit when Slatkin made his debut, and his early actions indicated he was just the man to lead the DSO out of difficult times. But just a year later, Slatkin had a heart attack and had to take a medical leave. He returned to the podium in 2009 with his health restored, but the financial problems of the DSO continued. Most crucially, the endowment fell below the $54 million, the amount that had been sold to bondholders to build the Max in 2001. That put the orchestra in violation of the loan covenant. It defaulted on the loan in 2010, and the debt on the Max became the responsibility of a consortium of banks which pushed for payment.
This was the financial situation in 2010, as talks began between the musicians and management to negotiate their contract, set to expire in August 2010. Key issues divided the two sides. While the musicians were willing to take a deep cut in pay of 22%, the orchestra's management wanted larger cuts, as well as changes in the work rules. Negotiations continued, but no agreement could be met. In October, the DSO musicians voted to strike. Thus began the longest and most contentious strike in the orchestra's history, which played out in the press with a tone that grew increasingly harsh and vituperative over 6 long months. The strike drew national scrutiny as orchestras all over the country, many suffering financially like the DSO, watched what was happening in Detroit. According to music historian Mark Clay, part of the reason why both sides are so inflexible is that each sees their response as being symbolic and having a domino effect all the way across the industry. The strike dragged on as more concerts were canceled. In February, management canceled the season. Then, in April, came a breakthrough. After 6 long months, an agreement was reached. The DSO returned to Orchestra Hall and gave a free concert to a full house of grateful and adoring fans.
After the strike, the atmosphere was still hostile between management and musicians, and its effects were lingering. In the fall of 2011, Slatkin began a number of initiatives to address the problem. He introduced a new neighborhood series in which the DSO performed in a number of suburban communities. The DSO returned to Carnegie Hall and played a program much praised by the work critics. And perhaps most noteworthy, they began an ambitious free web streaming program, making all of their concerts available worldwide to anyone with a web connection. Amidst all the turmoil faced by the DSO, the city of Detroit was fighting for its survival too. The city filed for bankruptcy in 2013. It was the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history. But as 2014 came to a close, the resolution of Detroit's bankruptcy came to a conclusion as well. It was a new era in which the concept of American arts organizations, including the nation's orchestras and the American city, had changed forever. What had changed since the early days of the DSO? James Osterreich of the New York Times wrote, "A century or so ago, when classical music thrived in a nation of immigrants, orchestras were a powerful force, flagship institutions that helped to put American cities on the cultural map. But this landscape has changed greatly over the last half-century, much as the country's economic, demographic, and cultural landscape has, and in many of the same ways. The economic fortunes of flagship ensembles have changed with the fortunes of their cities. There are few cities who have endured such profound changes to its economic, demographic, and cultural landscape as Detroit. It has been through the Great Depression, several recessions, and bankruptcy. It has lost more than half its population, most of its industry, and seen its cultural institutions transformed by these changes. The oldest of these cultural institutions, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, has gone out of business 3 times since its founding in 1887, its finances rising and falling along with those of the city. It has, however, managed to come back from all these challenges with its loyal audiences and supporters confirming its continued importance, a symbol of musical artistry in a city that cherishes its hard-won successes in the face of adversity. The future of the DSO and of the city it calls home will be shaped by how they face the continued challenges of the ever-changing economic and social landscape of the modern era. Guided, as they have been since the days of Father Gabriel Richard, by an inextinguishable spirit and a grittiness native to the city, they are both determined to survive, to adapt, to change, to hope, to rise from the ashes and be renewed. According to the Russian legend of the Firebird, which inspired Stravinsky's great modernist work and celebrates the ever-renewing spirit of art, the feathers of the legendary phoenix provide beauty and protection as it rises to live again. So too are the orchestra and the city entwined in a cycle of hope and renewal and the will to survive and to thrive together.
Call questions?
Yes,
I've already asked a few, excuse me.
Well, after the strike, we lost a lot of our players, particularly principals. Now there's a lot of young faces there. How do you rate the orchestra now?
Well, I'm not trying to, I will tell you, but I'd first like to know what you all think. Because I think on the one hand, as a musician, I always thought that the musicians were not noticed enough, were not paid enough, were not lauded enough. But I think even less appreciated are members of the audience. And this came very clear one time when I was giving a little tour of Orchestra Hall to the leaders of the volunteer organizations of the top 30 orchestras in the country. And at the end of the tour, we were standing in the oval lobby at Orchestra Hall, and a woman, a very determined woman, said, "Where did you get this audience? We would kill for this audience in," and it was one of the big 5 cities. She said, "Everyone was so quiet. They were so intent. They were so fixed on the stage and the music." And I said, "That doesn't sound to me like a bad thing." She said, "No, of course not." And that's the thing that, the reason, you know, as they say, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. Well, no matter what sound the Detroit Symphony makes, it's only as good as the people who appreciate it and respond to it. Okay? Now, what was your question?
It sounds like one you didn't want to answer.
No. And I'm not that clever. But I think the orchestra sounds, you know, wonderfully. I listened to the concert they did recently at the Our Lady Star of the Sea.
We were there.
Because, among other things, it was a bassoon soloist, Michael Ma, a wonderful, wonderful player. And I actually know he comes from Shanghai, and I tried to convince my wife that I was reverse Shanghai. When I retired, they brought someone from Shanghai. But the orchestra is really, all it needs to do is to continue, because there are aspects of ensemble between people that know each other and respect each other, and that have a good deal of time to get to know their, and these are not things that we could write down and say, you know, when so-and-so finishes a phrase, wait for 3.2 seconds before starting anything. You know, that there are things that are felt, because music does operate in a mode of emotion. And when our musical performers develop those extrasensory perceptions and those impulses to make a sound and to join a sound, those are the things that take a while. You know, that I know that my 35 years with the Detroit Symphony, it was up and down and all that. And throughout it all, the audience always applauded. And there were times when we thought, boy, I'm glad we got off without having things thrown at us. And, you know, because I hate to say it, at times we are the worst judges. But nevertheless, I don't think of myself as a good judge. I think it is a good orchestra, and it's on its way to being a great orchestra again. And that's why it's important that all the aspects of the orchestra continue.
One more. In your tour down at the hall, you talked about the original organ, and you said there was a chance that it's coming back. Has anything happened?
Yes, actually. And this, again, this is Detroit. We have not one, but 2 organs that can be installed in the hall.
One from forward. We have
the original Casa Von Frere, which was dedicated, we should take note of it. It was paid for by William H. Murphy, one of the organizing geniuses behind the 3rd incarnation of the Ford Motor Company in 1903. And he was a tremendous supporter of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. He had wanted to be a violinist, but he began going deaf as a student. So he transferred from the University of Michigan to Boston. And then really, he couldn't do anything about that. So he gave up a career in music. But he was with Simon Murphy, his father, Simon Murphy, the Simon Murphy Lumbering Company, which was on the banks of the Penobscot River in Maine. And that's why when they moved to the Midwest and lumbered all the white pine in Michigan and the Midwest, they built Detroit's first skyscraper. That's why it's called the Penobscot Building. And
And he owned and developed the very first, the central core of the Penobscot building. And he had built this was in the interim before there was a symphony. He had built a beautiful room where he would hire the local musicians to play for him. Didn't he also, is he the viola?
we don't know.
Okay.
We don't know.
But anyway, he was an incredible man. Murphy's,
William H. Murphy. And you'd be happy to know that the plans were drawn and the organ was built by Casamont Frere in 1923. And I had an argument with one of the younger members of the orchestra who's worked very hard, Brian Ventura, the assistant principal, to get the organ back. Because it was the most powerful concert organ in the world when it was built and installed. And it was dedicated appropriately for Mr. Murphy on St. Patrick's Day, 1924. So as we're looking ahead 2 days from now, you can say, this is not only St. Patrick's Day, but it's the anniversary of the dedication of the Murphy organ. Now, we have the organ now, and and their plans have been built, that how it could be installed. But in the meantime, they also demolished Ford Auditorium. So we got that was a wonderful Aeolian Skinner. So those things are just ahead, possible future.
What would it cost to install it, though?
Shouldn't worry about that. If you worry about that, you'll never install it. What is it? My hero, actually, Dr. Samuel Johnson. I don't believe he played the musical instrument, but he said if all objections were first to be overcome, nothing would ever be undertaken. And I felt actually another thing he said, that I could never write, but with the printer's devil at my elbow. This was, and that's why. I couldn't find a printer's devil, so I found this wonderful woman who was able to write the history of the Detroit Symphony.
Your tour downtown, you said $250,000.
Well, but that I don't want to sound like Anton Jarratti, but it's difficult to say because we will be changing the configuration because for all of its virtues. If we were there now, I could show you. And if you ever catch me at the hall, or if you don't see what I'm pointing out, telephone, and I'll try it once again. But the friezes on both sides, up at the top, with the two cherubim on each one. And you'll notice that this one here is quite ornate, with the acanthus leaves and things and everything coming up. And the other three on the right and two more on the left here are all clear of all that because they couldn't get enough sound. They wanted more sound, and they took that excess ornamentation off so that they would get more air coming out of the organ lofts, which were up there. So it's just a matter of taking the direction of doing what was right. And Orchestra Hall was homeless in 1970. In the 1980s, we were doing a benefit concert for one of our board members, judge of the appellate court, Judge Myron Walls. And at that point, Mrs. Lewis Redstone came across, to where I was sitting and said, I just want to say that this is just so wonderful, but I have to confess that when you started this back in 1970, we thought you were crazy. And I said, well, I was at that time. I said, I'd become sane in the interim. That's why I don't have time to reflect. But we, on the one hand, we had so little money that we could say that we will not commit ourselves to any project for which we do not have the money. And we will not do anything that's in any way going to deteriorate the acoustics. That if we decide to do something, because we were going to do everything, restore the hall exactly as it was. The stage floor, board for board, nail for nail, exactly as the original. And when we restored all that plaster, we had been told in 1970, 71, and again in 70, we were able to visit each project, measure twice, cut once. Well, measure 5,000 times and hope to have enough money to cut once. But we were told you have to use that old heavy plaster. And they just were going into lighter grades about the time this hall was designed. But you want to check into it and see what you need. And he said, if it's a heavy plaster, then you have to mix horsehair with it. Because otherwise you'll run the plaster off the wall and it'll just run back down. It needs that webbing to give it enough body and substance. So Michael Quinn, who now has his offices on Main Street in Ann Arbor, was working under Dick Frank, Richard C. Frank, who was the, among other things. You know the New Trump Hotel in Washington? That was in the old post office. Well, in earlier incarnations, Dick Frank restored that original old post office, and now he's been trumped. But at any rate, he was also the supervising architect for the restoration of the state capitol in Lansing, very famous architect. And we had sent the plaster off to a laboratory, and they came back and said how much silica, how much mortar. And they said, by the way, this thing you told us about horsehair, there's not horsehair in plaster. It's cellulose fiber. And now, do you want us to put horsehair or cellulose fiber? I said, my God, we're talking about saving the sun of the hall. We put cellulose fiber. So I think that was... Yes.
I told you two this at the history conference, but I was at the choral conference 2 summers ago, and Slatkin was the main speaker. And he was there selling his book and introducing his new wife. And what the amusing thing he said was, when I told my colleagues in Los Angeles that I had accepted the job to lead the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, they said I was crazy. They couldn't get over that. But he said, I have loved this job, and I love the response of the Detroit musical people who come to the concerts. So it was just encouraging to hear that he liked his venture.
Well, they've got a bunch of books to sell. So, go ahead. I'm sorry, Paul. Please.
No, I was just going to say that Maestro Slatkin's book is entitled Conducting Business. So we take the other way. Take the way of art, musical beauty.
Any other questions? Final questions? Thank you again.